G'day there. You're watching the Aussie Boom Guru, and today I've got a topic on the channel that is one that I've been wanting to talk about for quite a while now, and decided it's finally about time. So today we're looking at AI and architecture. So briefly looking at a few examples of AI-based tools, but also just discussing AI in general and my thoughts on what it means for our industry. If you do find I'm talking too fast, feel free to slow me down in the settings on YouTube, but let's dive in. So why have I decided to make this particular video? Well, a lot of people are talking about it right now in our industry and other industries, and a lot of people do ask me my take on AI generally and also in the context of architecture. So it is a highly relevant topic that we should all be aware of and thinking about. It will change the industry somewhat, and has just, I think, really just begun to start changing the industry. But there's a lot of misinformation out there. Just like we had BIM wash, there is definitely AI wash as well. And generally, I just find the topic quite interesting. It's an intriguing field. So artificial intelligence, it's a very broad term. There's a lot of definitions out there. I'll be honest, I spent just about 5-10 minutes trying to refine my own definition before going to the internet to see what everyone else thought. Luckily, mine was roughly in line with what I found. But simply put, to me at least, AI and the consensus of what I've searched for is it tends to be machines displaying a level of intelligence that you could compare to that of an average human. That's pretty vague still. So I think it's important to look at what intelligence really means. And I think the key thing that I believe about intelligence, and also from what I've found, is that intelligence is an ability to take data or information and apply it in different scenarios that maybe aren't always familiar to us. Obviously, as people, we do this all the time. With the stimuli around us, we react to things and we take information we've learned from before and try to put it into practice. Now, what we do in our brain is obviously highly chaotic and amazing, just the amount of interactions we can handle and the way that we can imagine things. It's quite an exciting component of biology, but to capture that in a computer is obviously quite difficult. So it's an interesting field in that regard. Intelligence is very hard to measure, I would say. There probably isn't too many, I think, defined ways to do so. One of the most classic ones you might come across that I've been aware of for a while is the Turing test. So taking an outcome from both an AI or a computer and a person and showing them to a blind tester and saying which one of these do you think is the person, which one is the computer, running that enough times and seeing if on average the AI or computer can convince a human that it's also a human. That's obviously one way you could do it, but there's not really any true tried and tested ways of doing it that I'm aware of. So AI works in, I guess, a simple way when you break it right down to its core fundamental concepts. It's really like any other program or algorithm. We're taking a data source, some sort of input or range of inputs, turning them into something that's workable or comparable or measurable, using algorithms or routines, processes, and finally turning that into an intended outcome. The outcome in most models that I've seen at least is delivered with some degree of confidence or accuracy, understood by the algorithm. So for example, if you've ever seen self-driven cars and the way that they view the road, there's various degrees of confidence that they apply to objects that they're interpreting. So you may not necessarily be 100% correct that you have a desired outcome, but you might be, say, 94% sure, and that's good enough to say, here's a result. So it's quite an interesting way that most of these models are actually working, and the algorithms themselves are obviously all different depending on the AI model, what it's being set out to do, and those algorithms and processes are typically going to be working with data and often with, I think, what they call learning sets, or data sets that actually are used to compare the data that's being returned by the model. Sometimes this is happening in various hidden layers of the AI model from what I understand, but I'm not even going to pretend that I understand this in depth. I guess the point here is that there is a lot of complex mathematics and computer science that goes into AI behind the scenes in pretty much all models, I would imagine. AI itself is already all around us. So if people say, I'm not worried, AI is not going to be here for, say, 40, 50 years, bad luck, it's already here. Some AI models are less complex than others or work in more obvious ways. But here's just some examples of everyday interactions with what one could say is AI to some degree, or just is definitely AI. For example, the spam filters. on your emails coming in are used to determine the likelihood that an email is actually worth reading or is safe. That's all come from a pre-trained language model that reads through what the email contains, what it's called, and from that you could determine that's to some degree a task that I guess human intelligence could try to parallel. There's a lot of AI wash out there. This is an issue with anything you can sell and make money from, of course, and AI is definitely a hot topic right now, so you're going to get a lot of hype and mislabeling of things that are called AI just for the sake of selling them as products, as ideas, or getting them out into the social media realm. To the uninformed, a lot of things could be called AI just because they do something that a human can do as well. For example, a calculator. You can put in numbers and get a sum. Some of those sums can't be done by a human easily. Is it AI? You could call a lot of things this if you really wanted to. So I think it's clear that we need to be careful what we label as AI in general, and also really just focus on what is new, what is relevant, rather than trying to repackage old solutions with new names. But AI and architecture is quite interesting. I definitely think that it's going to hit the industry faster than we realize it is, but it's probably going to be slower than we expect. I'm hearing a lot of pretty crazy claims from people that AI is going to transform our industry in less than 5 years, less than a year in some cases. And you go back 5 years and look at what our industry was doing. I'm not so sure it's going to change that quickly, even if something comes along that could change the industry that fast. We know that moving this industry is pretty slow and pretty hard. There's two pretty common predominant models of AI that I'm seeing sort of impacting architecture right now. And I've tried to sort of break them down into two AI models or general models that I'm seeing. One of them is the GPT style model, or in this case, working with inputs in this case, and getting information from a predetermined set of data and using that to generate more information. So typically in the form of text to text is the most common one. And the other one being text to image, which is I think called diffusion or diffusion modeling, or it's a form of machine learning from my research. But in this case, you might be familiar with things like dall-e or Craiyon, and we'll show an example of an app developed by a software developer in our industry that is implementing this type of model. So the future architect might look a little bit different depending on how quickly this technology takes hold. So GPT or GPT-3, chat-gpt you might be familiar with. These types of models just allow us to make so much more from just some basic inputs or prompts. Often people are using these to generate things like articles from almost just a simple request. The point though is that these models are typically taking information from sources like the internet, so it's unclear sometimes who owns the source of the data. It's a bit grey, and we'll talk about that later, but there is a lot of potential use cases in our industry in architecture, because we do a lot of writing in architecture. So I can see, for example, the ability to create reports and research much more quickly. Also copywriting, if you're trying to describe a business or a project. We may not need copywriters as much as we did, say, in 5 years from now, we might not really need copywriters. I do worry about their industry, I'll be honest. A really great one is if we can train actual AIs to work with specifications. That would be quite interesting. Currently, most of the models that we use are very general in application, but I think if we had some that were more focused on particular tasks or topics, we could see some pretty interesting outcomes, and specs is definitely an area that most people would love to not to have to do themselves anymore. But probably one of the most interesting fields I've seen it applied to is actually writing programs, or just generally programming, but there are probably many more applications than that. So a lot of people are coming to me and saying, is my job in programming in trouble because I can go and ask a program to write a program? I think definitely not. At the moment, from what I'm seeing, it's very good at putting together basic snippets or portions of code. Sometimes it gives the incorrect code as well. But maybe we can explore a basic example using ChatGPT and Dynamo and Python just to see how well it does. So let's say let's do something really simple. So in Revit, using Python and Dynamo, get all the views in the model. An error occurred. That's great. That looks great. Let's try again. In Revit, using Python, get all views. Gotta love these live demos. Let's try again. Okay. Test. Good. Okay, there we go. We're in business. So I'm going to put in a prompt here. I'm going to say in Revit, using Python, get all views. And we can see typically it's going to introduce some of the core concepts it's using. Some of these I don't believe are necessary. For example, it's talking about a view type enumeration, which is interesting. But in this case, we can see it's doing some things like getting what we call boilerplate code. This example, because it's a very simple one, is quite succinct. In this case, we're getting all view types. Very interesting. Collector of class view type. So this will print all the names of the views. I'm not sure why we're doing that. So we can see that the code's already done some strange things. It's sort of formed some assumptions about what we might want to do. So I think that this is probably such a common query on ChatGPT that maybe it's already started to form assumptions of what the next thing is that we might want to do with this, which is very interesting. But if I just grab this Python code, put it in exactly as it comes, immediately I'm going to get an error. So in this case, that looks like that's actually probably the wrong the wrong term for getting a document. Very interesting. I might just hijack a little bit of my own boilerplate, because usually to get the current document I would use this. This is a little bit different. I might maybe specify that we're doing this in Dynamo. In Revit, using Python for Dynamo, get all views. Let's try again. Maybe it's because it didn't think we were in Dynamo. That might potentially have confused it. Nope, it's still doing the exact same thing. Very interesting. Because I did actually do an example of this before and it managed to do it. It didn't sort of get this tripped up. It did manage to get document manager, instant current document. Maybe I'll be more methodical, because this time I was being quite methodical. We can already see that it's sort of struggling, but let's just say gets all views in the model, gets all the names of those views, and see if it does a better job with the boilerplate. So far so good. Not sure what we're using system for. Not sure why we need the Dynamo API. So it's already doing a few things that probably it doesn't actually need to do. So it's not really, in this case, using very efficient code, but it'll do. So I think this is going to work. I'm just trying to sort of read it as it goes. Now it is using print, and print is something we don't typically do in Dynamo. So for now, I'll just leave this instead and we'll try this. Now you can see in this case, it's still getting the active document in Revit incorrect. It's trying to use the Dynamo based method. So I'm just going to throw out an olive branch here, and I'm just going to instead give it the right reference. Document manager is currently not actually included, so I'm just going to also, and then we can see minus that error, I think it's okay. So if we just say that output is view names, we can see that it should successfully do what it asked it to. It has made some errors or just some mistakes at the front end of the code. So this sort of indicates to me that it's probably drawing upon some resources that maybe are a bit muddled in what they're doing or where they're from to create some code. It's probably not just taking it from one place. So that might be a symptom of that. Now let's try and make this just a little bit more complicated. Maybe I just want view templates from those views. So instead I'm going to get all views in the model, and I'm going to filter those views just to get the view templates. And then finally, I'll get the names of those view templates. So I've added like additional steps to the code. And this is usually how someone using a program like this, I think, would use ChatGPT. They would gradually test and iterate over their code. It's very unlikely it's going to complete a very complex piece of code for you without a good understanding of what your task actually is from a programmatic aspect. So again, we're going to ignore pretty much everything to that point because we know that the current document's not going to load using this syntax. But we can see here that I believe it's successfully got the view templates. So in this case, the variable naming it's using isn't great, but it's okay. It's interesting to note that ChatGPT does have context of what it's talking about previously. So it is trying to sort of teach us how our previous script was similar to this one. So you can sort of gradually build upon your code using ChatGPT as well, which is pretty interesting. But if I just go back to this point where my code begins, I am going to still have to say that the output is view template names. But it looks like it will get to the point where it just has got the view templates. So some of this isn't necessarily the most efficient or direct way to do it. So I don't think that this sort of thing is going to really teach you the best way to code, but it's certainly a great way to learn about the API at a simple level. Now you can give it more complex tasks. This is one of my attempts to give it something more complex to do. I did ask it to, in this case, get the first wall in my currently selected objects, find all the walls in my current view which are parallel to that wall, and then create a dimension between the centerline references of those walls. A fairly common sort of task you might use Dynamo for to create automated dimensions. Now in this case, it's not going to quite do it right, and I might just show exactly where it sort of stumbles. So if I do copy this in, it's not necessarily going about it the worst way. So immediately it's made an error in its assumption about the first wall. In this case, all it's doing is it's getting all the IDs of objects I have selected. That's fine, but then it's just taking the first item, regardless of whether it's a wall. So we can see already that ChatGPT's formed the assumption that the first object I will have selected is a wall. And this is sort of an indication of one of the things that concerns me about using AI for programming, in that you sort of bypass the logic you might break down when you're building a program, because you have to anticipate the way that people will do things or do them wrong. Maybe they'll have other things selected. ChatGPT doesn't apply any of this logic that you have to go through just in order to kick off a program properly and make sure it's going to work. It is sort of just assuming that you're working with very predictable inputs, very predictable scenarios like all elements are walls, which I haven't told ChatGPT, it's just made the assumption. From here, it's at least doing things like building a container list, getting the active view, and then for each element in that view of category wall, which isn't an element type, if the location's curved direction is almost fixed. So it's done a fairly complex piece of API right there, which is I'll be honest, great. It's at least found the point where I can filter down all the walls that are roughly parallel to that object. Pretty cool. Now at this point, it tries to create reference arrays and get the walls, get the endpoint references, and make dimensions between the references. It's a little bit awkward. I'm not quite sure if the endpoint references are the best references to use. I did in this case ask it for, I believe, the centerline references of those walls. I think in this case, that's not the correct reference that I would want, but at least it is close to what you would do in order to run through that process. It's interesting too that it starts the transaction all the way back at the start and then ends the transaction. Now, something interesting about this script, if I just take out a fair chunk of the code here just to make sure that it's probably going to work, it already makes a pretty big error early on that sort of stops the whole script from working. So if I go and select a wall just to make sure that my code will actually have a wall, let's select, say, this wall. In this case, we can see that already it's made an error in the API referencing for selection. So if I just go and grab a custom node that deals with selection, so I think I'm looking for selected elements. Selection. If I do want to grab the elements I have selected, typically I think you would go through the UI doc in this case. Yes, you would go through the UI app, active UI document, and then instead you would apply selection get element IDs. It's interesting in this case that instead it's tried to use Revit services. So it's forming some assumptions about how it thinks this code should work. Now clearly ChatGPT wasn't written to purely deal with Revit API. So it is trying to sort of work with general syntax from a lot of APIs it's probably been loosely trained on. But we can see within this, someone would have completely lost the right way to do something. And in terms of learning why that didn't work, that would be very difficult for a non-programmer to determine. So things like this sort of show me that I don't think programs like ChatGPT are really built to the point where we can just cut a programmer out of the equation, even though that's really what everyone seems to hope can happen with ChatGPT. So just a quick demonstration of some examples of code and some of the issues that ChatGPT runs into. But it's still interesting that it's getting to a point able to provide some basic code and at the very least try to teach us a little bit about the Revit API. So as you can see, I sort of think that it's unlikely that models like ChatGPT will actually be able to make the average architect just be able to put together working code if they don't know how to program at all. It can do little snippets and bits and pieces, but in terms of putting those together into a logical application, I think you'll still need to have a fundamental understanding of programming. So if anyone is looking at these models and saying, I don't need to learn to program anymore, I would say probably in the near future you would still need to learn. Maybe down the line you won't need to, but all indicators point to, I think, programming still being a good choice to learn in our industry. Another common use for AI that we're seeing is text to image or image refinement. In this case, they're drawing upon typically vast databases of images, often using a technique called diffusion to deconstruct and reconstruct imagery into more recognizable shapes in its own library or pieces of images in its own library. Potential uses could include concept design and inspiration. So rather than going around Pinterest to find mood boards, you might be instead putting text prompts into an AI model. Space planning is definitely something that an AI model could be trained to work with. If you laid out a programmatic scheme in here, you might eventually see models that are able to go and determine space plans from this. Rendering is one example of taking a very basic image and then using an AI model to go and refine that image into something more photoreal or more refined or more abstract potentially. And of course, eventually documentation has the potential to be refined and worked upon using AI models, drawing upon massive learning sets of drawings that might be of a similar nature. So a pretty broad range of what we could apply these types of models towards. So AI-aided imagery-based models is how I'd sort of try to wrap this all together. This field's definitely still at what I would say is a very experimental stage, both generally but also in architecture. From what I see, we still primarily depend on people when it comes to sketching, documentation, and design, especially from a legal aspect. It's very hard to sue an algorithm, of course, as we know, much easier to sue a person. Now, there are a lot of examples of text to image, image to image refinement, sorts of models out there. And in this case, I've just picked two. The first one I'm just going to literally breeze by. It's a little one that you've probably come across called Craiyon. And I just want to quickly observe an example of what it can do, but also its limitations that this will display. And then jump into a more interesting one called Veras by a company called Evolvelab. This came out, I think, in January, and I'm currently just trying the trial out. There'll be a lot of videos of other people trying it out if you want to see it, but this one works with Revit directly and takes imagery from Revit assisted with text prompts to create a AI refined image as an output. So I'm just going to breeze right through Craiyon, or used to be called dall-e. And I just tried to get the Sagrada Familia and put it in the style of Frank Gehry. And I think we can see in this case Sagrada Familia has really dominated the outcome of these images. I look at these and I don't really see Frank Gehry. I think that Craiyon was a really great sort of initial foray into AI. Midjourney is an example of one of these platforms that has sort of excelled well beyond where these models started. But really, generally, I find that these models need a lot of help and a lot of refinement to get a good outcome. Having said that, they're great for generating funny little images of amusing things like Shrek and Darth Vader having a fight. But let's get onto a more serious one. So in this case, I'm just going to jump into Revit. So I've installed Veras in this case into Revit. If you do want to try it out yourself, I might just quickly show their website. So if you go to Evolvelab's website, go to software, Veras, you can download in this case a trial, and once you put in your details, it basically just kicks off with 100 free images. and definitely worth reaching out to the team. They do a lot of really cool work, and I'm always keeping an eye on them, so keep up the great work. They also have a product, I believe, for SketchUp, so that's Helix, and then a product called Glyph, which deals with documentation, automation, and I believe Morphos is their generative design tool. So really interesting to see what they're up to. So let's just have a quick look at Veras. So I've just got a basic house model here. This is actually my remake of the Autodesk basic sample project. Let's just do an interior shot. So obviously this is a pretty ugly image, not looking great, probably can't show it to a client. I might just change the aspect ratio just a little bit. I think it does currently work best in squares in the trial. And I'm just going to boot up Veras. And it comes with a bunch of sliders that you use to basically inform how creative you want the image to be and how true to the original image you want it to be as well. Usually I put creativity around 70 to 75, and I tend to put style around 20 to 30. And style is usually how close you want to be to the original image in Revit. And then creativity is sort of how much creativity you want to give the algorithm to really change what's in the shot. Obviously, you're going to want to change a little bit here. I'm going to tell it it's an interior shot, and that's probably all I'm going to tell it. Maybe let's give it some information about the shot. So timber flooring, closer to the viewer, and dark ceramic tile flooring in the kitchen to the rear of the shot. In this case, I might say white polished joinery finishes with concealed pull handles. So I'm being very specific. And then I'll just say a grey marble bench tops with waterfall ends. So let's just see what it makes of that. I might also say greenery and landscape in the background outside the windows. And then we're probably also going to go to ChatGPT and try to get it to write a prompt for us instead, just to see how much AI can work with other AI. But we should find that it will at least create something that looks a little bit better than what Revit gave us, whilst potentially having some slight imperfections or artistic liberties. But I would say that's not too bad. That did a pretty good job. It picked the floor finish I wanted it to have, so we can see timber, and then we can see we've got these ceramic tiles in the kitchen. It's hidden all the handles, even though there were handles here. It's roughly found the appliances as well. It has innovated a little bit and put an extra sink in there. I'm not quite sure how it did that. We can see it's also added this microwave / oven stack. We can try and say fridge unit to the right of the kitchen and see if it figures this out. But I would say it did a pretty good job. It even got the turn down ends of the marble. It got the finish. So I can assume that this model, probably to some degree, I assume that they might be using another AI-based engine to do some of this work. But oh wow, did a really good job there. So it still didn't get the fridge, and it's for some reason it's got a weird little integrated microwave. But if you don't look too closely, you do get some pretty compelling visuals from some of these. It's even made the chairs look pretty good. Let's see if ChatGPT can give it more of a Japanese aesthetic. Give me an AI prompt for a Japanese house interior with a modern garden outside. And it will try and give us a little prompt just to give other AI models. So we're sort of seeing AI play with AI here. It's very specific, but I assume because it's come from an AI model, it's probably going to be well suited to another AI model. It's definitely taking a little bit of artistic liberty here, but we'll see what happens if we give this to the AI. Quite interesting. I actually saw Nico do this first on his channel. I thought that's smart. I like that. See what it makes of it. But I mean, I would say that's not bad for an image. It's definitely taken some liberty in what it's placing in the shot. But heck, from a distance to a client, that looks immediately better. Pretty cool. But of course, it's doing some weird things because it is using AI to some degree. We might have to reduce the creativity a bit. So immediately, I can definitely spot that is a lot more Japanese in appearance. The finishes certainly, the geometry of the cabinetry. There's some weird sort of AI stuff going on there. I mean, let's just make the style like 10, creativity maybe 65, and just see what happens if we just make it a little bit less creative. At some point, I find it goes back to a sketchy sort of looking style if you reduce it too far. But this might sort of rein in the model just a little bit. But I got to say, pretty cool. I have found that it sometimes does struggle with some scenes depending on how recognizable the shapes and the objects are. Yeah, so it's getting a little bit more sketchy there, but I mean, as a result, it's definitely a lot closer to the model. It's not using too much artistic liberty in this case. But I mean, to me, I quite enjoy like that shot, for example. It's actually pretty nice. The challenge here comes like if you want to make a little tweak to something like just change this area here. The model currently isn't set up to do that. Of course, you could make a program that does work more in that manner. But that is one limitation of working in this way. You're sort of dealing with a bit of an all or nothing approach to it, but it's very interesting. I think it does have potential. There are a couple of examples of shots I did before that were a little bit weirder, like a hospital where it did manage to figure out this was a person and their back was turned, but you can see it's taken a lot of liberty with what's in the room. This one, I think I put the creativity well and truly up the end. This one, I pulled the creativity right back, so it almost went for an artistic watercolor look, and this one was sort of in between. So sometimes it sort of gets a little bit closer, sometimes it doesn't. This one was a house, and I sort of took it through various iterations, but I found it was interesting that house frontages in this program definitely did get played with a lot more by the AI. So it was sort of ignoring portions of the design, like doing sort of pretty weird, zany things. So I think it depends on what data it's been trained on. It will do different things with different types of images and designs. So it can be good, can be bad, depending on what you're hoping the AI is going to do. But definitely got some really strange sort of outcomes here. Like it thought that this tree was some sort of disc with a grid on it. So it's not quite there, but I mean, artistically, it's very cool. Whether it's practical, I guess, is another question. But it's definitely an interesting app, and I think well worth trialing at least and playing with it, seeing what you can get it to do. But just an example of at least a company trying to do something with AI in architecture. From this, I guess, the question, if ChatGPT is the death of the programmer, is this the death of the sketcher? We're so keen to get rid of programmers, but you tell an architect to put their sketchbook away and they're going to go crazy, right? So it's interesting that there is a bit of a hypocrisy around what people want AI to do as architects. I think that there's a lot of gatekeeping in the industry, and it'll be interesting to watch which gates become under threat when AI does become more realized. There is obviously a really big shortcoming with this technology in that there's a lot of unconscious and unintentional design that these AI models apply when you're running them. I mean, obviously, it's great that the one that we just used by Evolvelab has some sliders to limit the creativity and the strength of innovation on your own design, but some of those, as you could tell, they completely did away with components of the design that were important or added components that weren't actually intentional. So I think that this is obviously more suitable earlier on in a project where everything's more fuzzy, and if something looks a little bit different, it's not going to break the bank, it's not going to blow the budget. So maybe rendering isn't necessarily the most immediate application for it. But it's definitely a powerful concept generator, I think, in the right set of hands. So I'll be excited to see where these go. There are obviously some major issues with AI, and I think a lot of these are being ignored by people using AI because they're very complex issues and very problematic issues. Obviously, a really big one is most of these AI models are scraping the internet or using data sets that haven't been paid for. There's no rights that have been applied on these objects. So whether they're not attributing works or just purely plagiarizing is a big question right now in the industry for people using especially image-based AI generators, but also text-based as well. Of course, who is the author? Just because I type in a prompt into an image generator, does that really make me the architect or the designer? Maybe not. It's a bit questionable. of course, who is legally responsible for the output of AI tools is ultimately, I think, going to be the biggest limiter of AI. You look at self-driving cars, for example. In some states in Australia, you still need to keep your hands on the wheel because you have to be the responsible driver of that car, even if you're not in control of it while the AI is working. So I think that this might be a pretty big limiter when it comes to implementing this technology in place of people. Rather, it might be a tool to aid people who ultimately make the liable decision. I think if we let AI go too rampant, we might eventually see a slow death of original concepts, original art, original images, original ideas, because ultimately everyone's creation is really just a recreation at some point if we're not careful. So I think that it does present a risk to creative industries if we abandon our creative will to tools that essentially do the creative thinking for us. Of course, as well, like AI, with BIM, there's a risk that everything gets oversaturated before it reaches its realized peak. People might be so sick of AI by the time it can actually help us that no one actually wants to use it when it's helpful. So we need to be careful that we don't just blindly follow this down the rabbit hole. So how will we overcome these issues? Unclear at this point on most of those, I'll be honest. As well as this, is AI really going to simplify everything? Let's draw back the attention to BIM. When it came along, a lot of people said, well, there goes the drafters, no one needs to draw anymore. We can hire less people, everything's easier and simpler and smoother. As we know, it didn't really quite play out that way. AI seems to offer similar things to the end user. But will we instead maybe see a similar complex emergence of different roles in our industry come on the back of this, with a new degree of complexity to manage in our processes and our programs? Maybe it might actually, make some things harder. You never know. So my current opinion on AI, just wrapping this all up, is that right now to me, there's still way too much hype around AI and not enough people doing deep, involved research on what it's actually doing or what it might do quite soon for people. Most companies out there developing AI-based tools, to me, seem to be developing proof of concepts at best, and then realizing it's really, really hard to do more than that and abandoning projects or just leaving them as they are. I really am excited to see what Evolvelab does with Veras. Right now, I would say it's still proving a concept to some degree. There's still anomalies in the outcomes, and it'll be interesting to see where the tool goes. But there's a lot of other companies I've seen before do similar things, but sort of reach a certain point and say, well, this is about as good as it gets. So I hope to see that people push these tools further. So if we can only do half-baked outcomes, often they don't hold up to the Turing test. It's very obvious when an AI has created something still, I think. There are some really great pieces coming out of these that I wouldn't know are done by an AI, if not just for recognizing that they look too complicated for a human to have drawn or modeled or have done. But there's still a lot of stuff out there that when you really hold it up to scrutiny, I don't think actually really holds up the test. I think programmers are actually needed more than ever. These tools look like they're actually going to benefit programmers quite a lot by making them faster and having more resources at their fingertips more quickly. But I think without the fundamental knowledge of programming behind someone's use of these tools, it's not really going to help people that much. So I think you need to understand the fundamentals of programming more than ever now that it's meant to be so easy to access programming. I think architects are still operating at a different level of creativity and problem solving that these tools just haven't quite proven to architecture yet. But I'm still excited to see where it goes. Apparently it's all ramping up and getting faster. So hopefully we'll see what comes in the following year. So I hope you found that interesting. I do keep all my resources over on GitHub. Obviously not really a practical topic, more of a talk, but thank you for watching. And I'm interested to hear what other people think about this field and what it might mean for architecture. Do you feel your job is threatened, or are you excited to see what you can do with these tools? Do you think it's all hype? Do you think that architecture needs a good kick up the backside? Who knows? Lots of things could happen. Likewise, if you have a video request in future, feel free to leave it down below or send me an email and I'll make sure to get back to you. So thanks for watching. I hope you found the topic interesting, and I think it'll continue to interest us as it moves on. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks. Take care. Bye.